Good day. I'm going to ask for a little forgiveness up front. I like to be casual. I like for us to try to entertain. And if I see interest, look out. I will probably continue on that subject if I see interest out here. Now, what I'm going to do is bounce around a little bit. I'm not going to try to just give you all the campaigns that happened after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. I want to talk about a few individuals, a few things that happened that most people don't realize happened. Andrew Jackson didn't win the Horseshoe and then suddenly go to New Orleans. There's a lot of things in between. Many of them happened in this area, and a few of them happened as we go a little further south towards Mobile. There's a lot of interesting characters, some of which you've never heard their names before. Well, I take that back. I see a lot of friends and a lot of people that have been active in researching this period, and they've probably heard a few of these names. We're going to talk about one guy that destroyed his career, another one that tried to have a career, a couple of legends that I'll pick at because it is such a romantic and legendary period that the 19th century writers writing about the War of 1812 and the Creek War in this area really jack it up sometimes about what really happened. Romanticism ruled. Sir Walter Scott influenced some of the writers. So, especially if they had a Scottish last name. So let's see what I can do here today. Of course, this is our palette. This is where it all happened. Alabama was part of Mississippi at the time, and Mississippi Territory. We see Mississippi Territory troops. If we break it down, many of them come from Alabama. We'll get back to this, but each one of those little dots and squares is where there's a fortification or a campsite or something going on. By the way, I got to get a commercial in. There's a new book about to come out on the University of Alabama Press called Topeka. It's a series of papers that were presented a few years back at Auburn University. I think the Humanities Foundation had something to do with that also. And now we got the book coming out. Should be within the next couple of weeks. After the Battle of the Horseshoe, they still had to clean up some problems. There were a lot of Indians running. Most of the Indians were running towards Florida. Florida was the home of the Great Satan. Florida was where the British were, where the Spanish were, and where the Indians that had just been defeated can run to. And the head of that, of course, is Pensacola. One of the things that this guy, Andrew Jackson, wanted to do was cut off all of those at the Tallapoosa River. Try to cut them between here and Tallahassee so that they couldn't get to Florida. Unfortunately, a few of them got through. A little aside, by the way, this picture has been used many times. It's an engraving. Now, obviously, it's at the Battle of New Orleans. You can see your cotton bales here. But we have a copy of it at Fort Toulouse, Fort Jackson that says Andrew Jackson at the Hickory Ground. So let's just use an image and put a new connotation to it if we want voters from Alabama to vote for us. Well, Jackson had some people that he brought in from Tennessee. They had been on the trail for quite a while, had finished the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and were pushing below the Tallapoosa were troops under North Carolina and Georgia officers that were supposed to cut them off. One of these troops was a man named Homer Virgil Milton. Homer Virgil Milton was a colonel of the 3rd U.S. Infantry, had gone into the Army in 1808 as a major. He started pretty high. And if you read his correspondence from that period on, he wants to know why he's not a general. He did make colonel, but he keeps saying he should be a general because he's been in 4 years. And his boss and some of the other bosses had only been in like a year and a half, and they became generals immediately. So Milton had a little problem with that. Well, Milton was in charge of the U.S. regulars south of the Tallapoosa when Andrew Jackson's troops arrived at the villages along the Tallapoosa. They were out of food. They were out of supplies. Jackson asked for supplies. Milton said, I don't have to give those to you. Well, a militia general still outranks a regular colonel. And he said he had no obligation to give any of it. But he finally said, I'll lend you some supplies. So he did. There was a little problem with that, as Andrew Jackson soon thereafter left, went back to Tennessee on April the 22nd, 1814, bounced around there at the Hermitage, and suddenly two generals resign. Andrew Jackson becomes a brigadier general in the U.S. Regulars. Then he becomes a major general in the U.S. Regulars and becomes in charge of all that area of Mississippi we just looked at, Louisiana, and Tennessee. He became Milton's boss. Milton banged around, never saw another big action from that point on, resigned in November and went home. I just saw not long ago where Milton is buried in Marianna, Florida, with a tombstone says, General Milton, who fought the British. I have a little problem with that one. But anyway, Milton brought his troops to Andrew Jackson. He tried to stay away as long as he could so he would not have to be under him. He did return when Jackson returned as the general to the Fort Jackson area, and tried to command the 3rd, but didn't do a very good job of it for that point. Another happening at Fort Jackson was the surrender of William Weatherford. Now, the reason I say it that way is I'm on a soapbox. In my opinion, and friends of mine, and genuine scholars, we're of the opinion that William Weatherford never heard the name Red Eagle in his life. These are people like myself who've researched for 30 years, 40 years in some cases, have looked at document after document after document. And we have never seen him referred to by any other name than William Weatherford until 1841. And in 1841, there's a book published. It's a long, long poem. The Red Eagle, a poem of the South. A.B. Meek, so-so poet, good historian, good literary man, great publisher in many ways. However, we never see the name Red Eagle until this time. This is 15 years after William Weatherford's death. William Weatherford had two other names. He went by Billy quite frequently. He also was truth teller or truth sayer. It's according to how you translate his Indian name. And the other Indian name was Biliani. Biliani is Yellow Billy. That's very common. So that's my soapbox about William Weatherford. But the other thing that we found out recently, and I say recently within the last few years, and we've published it in one spot, is that the other legend that goes with this is when William Weatherford took off with Andrew Jackson and went to Nashville to hide. And that Jackson took him to the Hermitage. We don't believe that one either. The reason we don't believe that one is we found documents where even though he was a leader of the Red Sticks, the hostile Creeks during this period, that when they needed somebody to keep the White Stick Indians attached to North Carolina troops in line, the North Carolina colonel chose Billy Weatherford to do it. These troops left Fort Jackson, went down the Alabama River, past Cahaba, to a place that's today known as Militia Bluff, and on the way brought in refugees. That was their job, was to bring in refugees. It goes well with what William Weatherford's plans were, which was to feed and help his people. When he surrendered, he says, that's what we have to do. Andrew Jackson was of the same attitude. He took over, one of the first orders he gives is 23,000 rations to the Indians. He's a little more pragmatic in it, that he did that because he says, if we don't feed them, we've got to fight them again. And they've destroyed their crops. So Weatherford went with a man named William McCauley and Jesse Pearson. They went down the Alabama River, bringing these refugees in, and McCauley writes a letter later of how he sat by the fire talking with William Weatherford. Well, this was in May of 1814. He surrenders April the 18th. So I don't see him getting to Nashville and back and forth because he was out there. So he goes to work for the U.S. government, helping his people, not hiding at the Hermitage. Okay, number 2 on things I want to pop at. Another view of the surrender of Weatherford, which gets a little romanticized as we do this. It's always fun to see the 1830s hats on them. And I like the concrete steps in front of Jackson's tent in the woods. But who am I to be picky? But one big event at Fort Toulouse, Fort Jackson area was the Treaty of Fort Jackson on August the 9th, 1814. It was punitive, it was strong, and it hurt. Jackson was not supposed to be part of the treaty negotiations to begin with. There were no negotiations. It was, this is what you got, this is what you're going to take. A guy named Thomas Pinckney was supposed to be there. Thomas Pinckney, during the Creek War, during all of the time that Jackson's getting his allocates and laurels, is Jackson's boss. Jackson is not the great leader, not the leader. This is the Pinckney family of South Carolina. Pinckney was actually educated militarily in France, had negotiated treaties with the Spanish, was a very astute, organized man. And he was the boss. But what had happened is we had a guy named Thomas Flournoy, which is a name to forget, who is based in New Orleans, who was supposed to be over this whole area. But when the war broke out, Flournoy could not get the troops together and was pretty much trapped on one side of the war area. So they put Pinckney, who was based out of Augusta, Georgia, here in charge of that war, even though it was in somebody else's district, which calls for, well, I don't want to tell you, just can you imagine the military in two different commands and two different divisions trying to do this? Flournoy had enough trouble trying to defend New Orleans potentially and Mobile. But there were a lot of problems of, I need supplies, I'm sorry. The answer would be, because you're no longer in my district. And that happened to the poor 3rd Infantry, the other part of the 3rd Infantry. I'm trying not to get too far into the 3rd Infantry, but I'll tell you this. Those guys could march. Those guys, oops, I blanked myself. Those guys at the beginning of this period had been stationed here, moved to Pass Christian, then to New Orleans. They were going on their way to Cincinnati. They got to Natchez, the war broke out, they come across Mississippi, Fort Stoddart, up to Fort Toulouse, Fort Jackson area, and then back down and started all over again. So it's a little fun. And their supplies were being sent where they weren't. Their clothing and everything else. That's just one of my favorite groups. But anyway, the punitive treaty had this amount of Alabama and that amount of Georgia taken away from the Creek Indians, the Muskogees. That's pretty punitive. But there's two things about it. That opened the valleys of Alabama for transportation from the Tennessee area into Mobile, into the Gulf Coast, and put a boundary or border, barrier, there's the word, between the Muskogee and Florida and the Spanish and the British. That's what that was about. Map I've done in the past trying to show some of the troop movements through Alabama. Some of these have to do with the Creek War, some of them have to do with the later stuff. But to give you an idea of how many different spots are affected in Alabama, this will show you all these paths. One that we'll get to later that a lot of people do not realize existed, especially in the War of 1812 part of it, is this one. And that's the way that John Coffey's troops came from Tennessee to Mobile. All the rest of them are actions, movements, etc. I know that there's one person with us whose ancestor went from here to here, all the way around to here. That's Blues campaigns. That's one you won't hear of. It's the War of 1812 campaign. That was the Tankersley family locally. And that's how they ended up back in this neck of the woods. Pensacola, like I said, was hated by everybody in the Southeast, except those that hated St. Augustine. St. Augustine was that for the Eastern. That's the Georgia folks, and it was also in Florida. I think it's really interesting that all this hate among this area, and next week or next month we'll hear from Hart talking about how we all need to go to the coast now. But this is the general feeling by many people in the country. British officer collecting the scalps, giving the money. The Brits are the root of all of this Indian problem. I'll leave that one up there for just a minute and check my notes because I'm not sure where I am anymore. No, I know exactly where I am. Another guy whose career was really in trouble was a man named Thomas Hart Benton. This is the Thomas Hart Benton that later spent 30 years in the Senate. Was a great fan of Andrew Jackson on the national stage. Thomas Hart Benton went to Tennessee after he flunked out of North Carolina and became quite a politician. His career was going to have some problems, though. He was the lieutenant colonel of the 39th Infantry, that great unit that was at Horseshoe Bend. But he learned the lesson of don't have your brother shoot Andrew Jackson in a duel. It does cramp the style of your career. Every time there was something major about to happen, like Horseshoe Bend, Benton would get orders to go on the recruiting duty, or go do this, or go do that. Benton and that troop was at Fort Jackson. They left Fort Jackson, went to Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is the location of Fort Stoddart and the Mount Vernon Barracks or cantonment. While he's down there, he wanted to get some glory. So he got with, that aforementioned Gilbert Christian Russell of the 3rd Infantry. 3rd Infantry split in two. They're in the west and they're in the east. And they get together and they say, we're going to go attack Pensacola. We have no orders to do this, but we're going to go do it. So they take off and they're told no. Milton sends an order saying you can't do it. So Benton then decides a little later, Milton only commanded the 3rd, that he was still going to go to Pensacola, and he got with George Nixon. Anybody heard of George Nixon? See, I told you. George Nixon commanded the Mississippi troops. After Claiborne was here, Claiborne became ill. Nixon commands Mississippi troops, which included the Alabama guys from down and around Mobile, and they take off to go take Pensacola. Benton gets diarrhea, fever, and a few other things. They had to take him back in a litter, and he almost dies. Nixon continues. And he continues, and he goes down the Perdido, and he goes down the Escambia, goes all the way to the edge of Pensacola, but doesn't take Pensacola. Has battles, fights in the swamps. One action, they burned 130 acres of Indian corn and supplies. Captured 84 people, wounded many, killed a few, but you never hear that battle. Well, one thing, it's in Florida, but it has to do with what's going on up here. But there are actions that happen along the Alabama rivers and different places that are much smaller. There's another action with the Crockett group and all where they killed 32 Indians. You never hear that battle, and that's more Indians than were killed at Holy Ground. So there are major actions that still have to be written up, still have to be talked about. There's Benton in his later years, which, if I remember right, his daughter married a guy named either John C. Fremont. So he did push for folks to go west. Well, we're now moving down into this area. When Nixon and them come back from the Pensacola campaign, Nixon goes to Fort Claiborne. The Benton's troops, the 39th Infantry, they go up into the Tensaw. They go up to the area around Fort Mims. And here I'm going to jump on another misconception or mistake. They built a fort there called Fort Montgomery. That Fort Montgomery was because they needed to guard one of the main things here, and the reason you keep seeing this is the main ferry. Main reason that the Federal Road comes through here, and why Fort Mims was important, and why everything's kind of concentrated in that area is transportation. Transportation. That's because Mims has a ferry. Across from Mims on the Nanahubba Island, just you cross the river, then you cross the island, then you cross one more river, is another ferry. So if you want to get from east to west across the Mobile Delta, there's only one spot you can cross with two ferries. And that's why that's so important, because the road to Baton Rouge, everything else, starts on the other side. So that ferry is really important, and the transportation route does. But they need to guard that a little bit better, because the forts up there, Fort Pierce, Fort Mims, what's left of it, which is a blockhouse, and everything else is on the other side. So they built Fort Montgomery. Unfortunately, later historians have gotten confused about who Fort Montgomery is named after. There's a guy that's stationed there later named Elijah Montgomery. He's in the 7th U.S. Infantry, and I won't even go into the numbering systems right now. He's in the 7th U.S. Infantry, and he's actually an ancestor of Winston Grooms. And people have assumed, because that's the only Montgomery they've seen that was there, and many times you name the fort after somebody that's there, that it was named after him. Well, the truth of the matter is, this is the 39th U.S. Infantry. This is the first fort they've built since the Battle of the Horseshoe. Has anybody got an idea who this guy is? Lemuel Parnell Montgomery. 39th names it after Lemuel Parnell Montgomery, not somebody later. And Montgomery should get that credit. It does confuse some early geographers also, who thought Montgomery and Fort Montgomery and Montgomery here were the same place. A very famous young officer from the War of 1812 period named Daniel Appling, that's Appling County, Georgia, in that area, dies at Fort Montgomery in 1816. Several of his biographies and other places say he's buried here in Montgomery. They just can't get it straight. He does die there. So that's my other little complaint. So you get all these troops down here, and what are you going to do with them? You're going to invade Florida, and you're going to take Pensacola. Many people do not understand how Jackson went to Pensacola. And here goes another little thing I want to pick at, which is called the Jackson Oak. The Jackson Oaks in Baldwin County, and you notice I said plural, because many people claim to own the Jackson Oak where Andrew Jackson stood and made a speech, had his tent, etc. Hamilton in Colonial Mobile actually makes the mistake of saying that Andrew Jackson left to take Mobile, went across Mobile Bay to take Pensacola. Here's the problem. When Coffee came down this route, he brought over 1,000 troops with him on horses. Troops came through this way from Tennessee, and all the Jacksonians. Now Jackson himself brought some of his troops into here. The 3rd Regiment had already down here. But he concentrates them all right here, around Fort Mims, Fort Montgomery, etc. They put their horses on Nanahubba Island. There's no supplies in Mobile. But the other thing is now he's got pushing 3,000 troops. And he takes the road from Pensacola to Fort Mims. That's how he goes. He doesn't go. He's better with things than I am with buttons. He doesn't go across here. Can you imagine taking 3,000 troops out of Mobile, trying to get to the eastern shore with only about 10 or 12 boats at your disposal? And they're also watching this very, very hard. Now, somebody was very upset when I told them Jackson did not do that. So I went back into Jackson's papers, checked all of his correspondence, and he wrote letters all the way there and all the way back. One of the reasons he wrote so many letters is that Jackie Donaldson, his nephew, Rachel's nephew, was ill. And he was writing about taking Pensacola and who was ill. And every one of them shows him on this route. Now, the standard route from Mobile is this way. But then you have a problem when you get to the Perdido and you have to ferry it again. The main thing is you've got a road, you got a way to cross, and you got supplies. So they made a loop And that's confusing to a lot of people of why they did it that way. I don't have a watch. I don't know how bad I'm talking. That's John Coffey. Is that the Earl? Bob? There's not? Okay. Andrew Jackson then has his troops concentrated at Mobile. He takes his concentration, he's down there, and I left out one thing in between. Before he goes to take Mobile, after the earlier assault on Pensacola, the British try to attack Fort Boyer. Fort Boyer was located exactly where Fort Morgan is now, on the end of the Mobile Point. There'd been a fortification begun there in as early as 1813. It was great. The Brits came over, they attacked, their ships got sunk, their troops got scattered. It was a great victory in September of 1814 for William Lawrence, Major Lawrence. It really kept the ability to defend New Orleans there, because what the British were looking at was trying to go backwards to the way that Galvez had taken Pensacola and Mobile. Galvez, during the Revolutionary War, had come from Baton Rouge, came down to New Orleans, across, takes Mobile, then Pensacola. If you can cut the river above New Orleans, you've done a lot. And there's one little thing about it. Coming out of Mobile or coming down from this way, you do not go across the swamps around Biloxi. You go north. You go north about 70 miles, and that way you can get across. That's where the road is. From that ferry and those settlements up there to Natchez or to Fort Adams, which is very south Mississippi, and eventually Baton Rouge. The Spanish still claimed to own the area around Mobile. We had taken it from them in 1813. We had also taken the Mississippi area, and we'd taken the Louisiana areas that were all part of Florida. How many of y'all know that Baton Rouge used to be in Florida? It was in West Florida. And they still call them. Those parishes in Louisiana are still the Florida parishes. So that whole strip had been taken. The only parts of the United States added to the United States during the War of 1812 are Mobile and Baldwin counties. They were done in 1813. The war started in 12. Jackson builds his troops up. We have more troops coming in all the time. We hear about the Tennessee troops. We hear about John Floyd's Georgia troops. There's a guy named John McIntosh that comes in from Georgia, brings in a whole regiment of Georgia troops late in the war. There's late war Tennessee troops coming down. They're concentrating in the Mobile area. A little personality clash there was between Andrew Jackson. Can you believe he didn't get along with anybody? Or this guy. Guy from East Tennessee, which makes him a problem to begin with, who had a drinking problem. And because of the command status, he was a general in the militia, and the highest ranking regular that was in Mobile at the time was a colonel. Jackson issued a very unusual order saying that only the colonel of the regulars could command the regulars. And so he kept the regulars from being under Nathaniel Taylor, the drunkard, the alleged drunkard from Tennessee. And he gets a semi-retired general named Winchester from Tennessee to come to Mobile. They're building troops up there. Mobile is doing all right. Jackson's taking his troops across. There's one little problem. After the Battle of New Orleans, the last battle of the War of 1812 is fought in Alabama. And that is at Fort Boyer. Again, this time the British are a lot better organized. They come in with about 5,000 troops. Lawrence has got about 200. They're adding more. Lawrence didn't just surrender quickly. He killed more than 20 British troops. Had one of his guys killed. And then finally, he surrenders. So Fort Boyer wins one, loses one. But the British then controlled all of Mobile Bay. They had the Navy off of there. They had 5,000 troops on Dauphin Island. This is in February of 1815. They're planning their attack on Mobile. There's a problem, or the good news. February 22nd, they get this note. War's over, really over. We signed the treaties, no more fighting. That was the key. It would have been a very interesting situation if the British had been able to take Mobile, cut the supply lines from Tennessee, go across to the Baton Rouge area, and see what they could, whether or not they could strangle New Orleans. One other little quick example, and I've got this one up here. It's not an advertisement for coffins. Is even after this is all over, there's one little problem. They've had a mutiny at Fort Jackson, at Fort Williams, and a little bit at Fort Strother. Tennessee troops had mutinied. The mutineers were shot between downtown Mobile and Fort Whiting, or Brooklyn area, in that area. And that's what this was. And it keeps coming back to haunt Andrew Jackson in its presidential campaigns. And so we have the coffin built. The guys did revolt, and that's about as far as I can go on it. There are very... Why did he kill them after the war? I'm not sure. But we do know that there had been a mutiny early in his campaigns. What's not really brought up that much is there was a real problem right before the Battle of the Horseshoe. John Coffey and them are issuing orders about sedation, mutiny, etc. So there's a problem of mutiny all the way through, and I think he's just trying to make his final point. Not to say it's correct. But, in fact, if you look at the number of people executed during the War of 1812 under different commands, the truth is Jackson had one of the lowest percentages of anyone. Many were sentenced to be shot. And then right before they were shot, he would commute their sentences. But he has one of the lowest for the number of troops, percentage-wise, of actual execution. Now, usually, I think they wait a little bit later to take questions. I really like talking with folks rather than at folks or to folks. So I'm going to throw it open for questions a little bit earlier. And see, this is for y'all to help me with this stuff. So she's getting the microphone, and we're going to do some questions. He had his hand up first.
I always hate to ask a question in front of this group because the answer would be so obvious. But isn't there something about the Battle of New Orleans was fought after a treaty was signed? Am I mixing that up with something else in history?
The treaty had been signed in Ghent. It had not been ratified, had not been accepted, but it was after it had been signed in Europe. But it had not been ratified. And that's a big difference. It wasn't ratified and notification until February.
So I'm assuming, did Jackson even know?
No, he did not.
Happened? So even if he had known, though, that had been signed, you're saying not necessarily would he have called off the troops?
Not if he's being attacked. He's gonna fight. He's gonna fight. There have been some fun situations where people say, okay, if they win the Battle of New Orleans, or even if they had gone into Mobile 2 weeks later, the British would have sided with the Spanish, saying that's still their property. The British did not recognize the Treaty of Fort Jackson. There would have been a lot of things if they had held Mobile and New Orleans, even if the war was over, that could have been some complicated and traumatic situations for the South. You can't, this is all supposition, but if they had held those, it would have changed the whole picture for 20 years.
One more thing. The Montgomery that was killed at Horseshoe Bend, that's where he was killed, right? And that's what the county is named for, Montgomery County.
Right.
Not the city. Where is that Montgomery buried?
At Horseshoe Bend.
At Horseshoe Bend.
There's a marker for him at Horseshoe Bend. Nobody's ever dug him up to look. I got a little fun thing. Going through his papers, I found something. He was a member of the Nashville Ball Club. And you kind of go, ball? And then I did some more research and was finding in Christmas Day of 1813, it has nothing to do with this, but it's fun. The entertainment for the troops and the officers was town ball, which is an early version of baseball. And so my opinion is that they're playing baseball. That may be the earliest baseball ever played in Alabama. And you know, it sounds like they were very organized. Yes, sir.
Selfish question, genealogy question. The North Carolina troops that came to Fort Decatur and then they went down to Cahaba, as you said, where in North Carolina were they from?
Most of them around the area near Chapel Hill. And you will really recognize it when you go up in that area. One of the main streets in Chapel Hill is Macaulay. That was one of the officers. You go through a little town called Mebane, and that was another one of the officers. Graham is another little town, and he was the commanding officer. You see a pattern here? Okay. They're in that central part of North Carolina. There were other North Carolina troops that were raised from the Raleigh area, a little further to the east, but they were mainly stationed to guard the East Coast. Remember, the Carolina troops, it's a brigade. It's 2 regiments, 1 regiment North Carolina, 1 regiment South Carolina.
Okay. But the troop from Raleigh and east of there, that would have been Wayne County. That's what I'm looking for. But they didn't get into Alabama?
I would have to look, but I'm just saying from what I see, most of those guys are from the Chapel Hill and a little west area.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. I've been told to wait till it gets there.
Fascinated by this era. Is this on?
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by this era. I'm kind of a genealogist. I've got my mother challenged me to do her genealogy and found out that her, about 4th great grandmother was a Cherokee Indian, I guess, and she was married to Benjamin Jernigan, and there may be some Jernigan folks in here, I don't know, but they settled around, they were asked by Andrew Jackson to come and settle in the Escambia County area near Fort Crawford because Jackson anticipated having to fight the Spanish in Pensacola, and the problem, that's the reason there was so much mutiny. The reason they mutinied was because there was the food. They were starving to death. They were, the Indians had burned the land. It was a scorched earth policy, of course, and so there was very little food for them to scavenge, and so there was a real problem with the supply lines. But my interest, because I found out about that Native American connection, led me to the study of Horseshoe Bend and the whole Creek War and what happened to the Indians after the war. We hear a lot about the American troops, but not much about the Indians. We in Dothan have a Weatherford family, as a matter of fact, and they're supposed to be originating from Tennessee, kind of founded up there when Weatherford was in Tennessee. So there may be a little bit of research we need to do to see if perhaps there might be another connection there. Anyway, all of this led to 2 novels, and I've got the first one coming out the end of September, looking at this war from the Indian perspective, Swimming with Serpents from Mercer University. So, thank you so much for all looking at it from a different perspective. Let
me treat to another thing real quick. It's going to take her a minute to get back to you. One of the problems we've had with genealogy and finding some of the Tennessee troops and some of the other troops is that a guy will do his 3 months, he'll go out, then he'll do another 3 months later, and somebody's looking for him in that gap period. One of the things is that there is not a commissary general and there's not a quartermaster set up like we think of it now. The way that supplies got to there is they hired people with pack horses. They hired people with wagons. They are not in the Army. They're being paid more than if they're in the Army. And so they come with them. The thing is, these people actually carried guns. They would fight with them. And they have a genuine record of being with Andrew Jackson and being supportive, but they're not going to show when you look in the military records. And one of the students at Jacksonville State, stand up in the back here, is taking the William B. Lewis records of inventories and expense reports and noting those people, because there's a lot of people that are involved in this war that you don't see the records on during that period. And so he's taking that, trying to identify these guys that are doing the pack horses, the guys that are doing the wagons and all of this. And I'm going really blank with his name today, and I hate to admit it, because he's a really nice guy. And that's why I made him stand up, so you can see him. He's got the little goatee, he's got the plaid shirt. Go by. I hate that. Yeah. And I'm getting just old for this stuff anyway. Another question, please. Yes, ma'am.
It's been a long time, and I'm hoping you can refresh my memory. The coffin bill is configured the way it is because there were 4 different groups of executions or punishment. And I believe the first one was a militia, 18 or 19-year-old militia boy that was killed for insubordination. And Jackson was highly criticized for using regular Army punishment on the militia. Were the other ones that he executed, were they considered regular Army or were they considered militia?
Majority of his executions, and I believe that's I think it's Justice execution at Fort Strother that you referring.
I don't remember the name.
It's one of them they have at Fort Strother, and there's an interesting description of that they actually tied him down and then shot him and rolled him in the hole. They netted him down, as they say. It's more militia than anywhere else. Now, if you study him, you study the Virginia militia, you'd rather be in the Tennessee militia. For punitive and corporal punishment was much tougher. They didn't shoot him as often, but what they did to them otherwise, putting a bayonet in their mouth and 2 buckets of sand on each end of the bayonet for 2 hours. If you're drunken, they would tie a canteen around your mouth that you'd have to wear for the day. On a lighter note, one of the greatest descriptions of a drunk I've ever seen was a man named, I believe, Sam Justice, another justice, who was convicted at Fort Jackson for luxurious intoxication. I think that's a great name, isn't it?
Do we have another question? Here's one.
The question I want to ask you, burnt corn, would you consider that to be the first battle of 1812?
Not the Battle of 1812. No, it's the first action in Alabama, because the first battle of the War of 1812 happened 200 years ago last week, or this week. And that's actually up in Michigan. Remember, burnt corn's in 13. And so you've had 6 to 8, 9 months nationally.
Burnt corn and then they attacked Fort Mims?
Yeah, burnt corn, then Mims. You're talking July and August. And it's the first, I'd say, organized action in Alabama. But no, the war starts earlier. It gets there.
Wasn't there a village in the Fort Toulouse area, the name of was Tuskegee, the original Tuskegee? It's
Tuskegee or Tuskegee. It's a couple of different spellings on it.
And was that village still there at the time of the war?
As Jackson writes and some others write, you have stood on the ashes of Tuskegee. So it insinuates to me that there was a village that they burned out. They burned villages, Fusahachie, all across there, all across the Tallapoosa Basin, Maclassa, trying to find each one of those for the 1812 period and identify it as such as a a goal of Craig Sheldon, Dr. Craig Sheldon, Emeritus at AUM, trying to make sure which one is 18th century, which one is 19th century, and which one was active at that time. They burned villages left and right as they came down. Basically, the water divide between the two rivers, between the Coosa and the Tallapoosa. It's a great place to have a trail. And they came down through there and spread out, went both ways, while the others are coming south of us. Now, there were some villages, they weren't burning as much after Weatherford's surrender as they're bringing in their refugees. There was a huge refugee settlement around Fort Jackson. Whoever gets it first. Okay.
Have you found in your research that the massacre, the Hillary massacre, is as significant as some historians have said?
It's quite significant in that the mistake at the Hillary massacre was that was a group that had said we don't want to fight, we give up, and then they were attacked. So many other groups that might have wanted to surrender had great doubts about doing it at that time. An interesting thing about the Hillary massacre is it wasn't whites that massacred. One of the great letters that I found years ago was by a guy named Gideon Morgan. Gideon Morgan was part Cherokee, but he commanded the Cherokee. He was primarily a Cherokee, like John Ross and many of the other Cherokees. And he writes a letter that he's so proud that no white man killed anybody at Hillary. It was all the Cherokees. So it was a little different, but I think it had some major effect on some of the others that might have surrendered earlier. Okay. Does that answer it?
Yes, thank you. That's new information. Some of the research that I have read, have done, said it was a disagreement between coffee and white.
It was a lack of communication between coffee and white, much more than it was a disagreement. They didn't necessarily get along. White was East Tennessee, coffee was at what they called Nashville was West Tennessee at that time. And they're not getting along, they're not communicating. But the Cherokees under Morgan were attached with white.
Was one of them court-martialed for that action after the war?
I don't remember on that one.
I forget whether white, I'd have to look it up.
Oh, White, no, he's chasing Koch around quite a bit because he's trying to court-martial him, and they're political enemies. In fact, there's a letter later on that says after the Horseshoe and all this that the Koch is very quiet. He's keeping his head low in Knoxville.
Was he court-martial?
No, he was not. And they tried to do it they tried court-martial, but they couldn't do it. Yeah.
My question concerns more the archaeological side of
Yeah.
the work y'all are doing at Fort Toulouse. I'm researching the archaeological record in the digital archive, and I'm wondering, have y'all made any efforts toward digitizing a lot of y'all's records? Or using digital?
The answer is no.
Okay.
The other answer is we would love to. We are a state agency with state funding, at least this week. And we'll see what happens in September. We've lost over 56% of our state budget within the last 3 years has been cut. So get that commercial in too. It'll be interesting in September to see when the referendum comes around. Because if it doesn't, boy, I don't even think about it, except that I'm real close to retirement.
We have time for one more question. Do we have one more? Final comment.
Tom? And I'll hang around for a little while if you don't want to ask your question in public. I'm bad about that too.
Jim, are there any accounts of what the land was like and the evening sky or the animals, weather, like William Bartram type observations from the
And
surface?
another commercial book coming out this week called Topeka. And one of the chapters in it, I think John Hall's chapter, is what the land was like at the time of the Creek War. One of the ones that has been done by somebody a lot better than myself. Okay?
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank y'all.
And Jim Parker will be here for a few minutes if you would like to speak with him after the program.